As everyone, thank you for the invitation, for the wonderful reception, for everything to make this conference really successful. Let me go on because we are low on time. Prince Maximilian Wied is not a household name. Mention of him, even in well-educated circles, more often draws a complete blank, sometimes accompanied by a snicker because of his obscure name and title. Why then should I be talking about him in this conference? One answer is that he was an important German explorer whose views were formed in the Enlightenment, who undertook 2 arduous scientific trips to South and North America and wrote fascinating accounts of these journals. A second answer is that his narratives provide us with subtle ethnographic descriptions of the native inhabitants he encountered in eastern Brazil and the upper Missouri Valley in North America that are still invaluable for scholars and those interested in these peoples. But the third and most important is that his whole endeavor was shaped by his studies in Göttingen under Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, whose program he sought to implement in these relatively virgin lands. In this sense, Wied's works embody the type of ethnographic knowledge Blumenbach called for to understand peoples of the other lands. Blumenbachian ethnography in action. Johann Friedrich Blumenbach's ethnographic views have long been seen as controversial. For many Anglo-American commentators especially, he has been described as one of the fathers of modern scientific racism. This view is underpinned by reference to the highly skewed and racial-inspired 19th century English translation of his work on human variety. But those who have read Blumenbach, and most of you all have in the original, know how wrong this judgment is. For Blumenbach was a fierce advocate of the spiritual and mental equality of the members of the human race, even though he did seek to evolve some heuristic models of physical differentiation. At the same time, he also recognized the arbitrary nature of such classifications. Unlike racist discourse, Blumenbach did not link physical differentiation with spiritual, mental, or moral abilities. Human physiognomy did not demonstrate or reveal the inner life of peoples, a position that corresponded to his mentor and then colleague, Georg Christoph Lichtenberg's critique of Lavater's physiognomy. Blumenbach's advocacy of the intellectual and the spiritual equality of all peoples was clearly made evident in his work, Abbildungen naturhistorischer Gegenstände, where he offered his readers not those skulls, but fully fleshed out images illustrating his 5 broad categories of human varieties, namely the Mongolian, American, Caucasian, Malaysian, and Ethiopian. The 5 images he published made it clear that all of these people were highly intelligent, capable, and worthy of equal respect. He depicted each variety with real historical figures whose features Blumenbach thought accurate and representative of the delineated group. The personages Blumenbach chose to portray each variety were fascinating. The Mongolian was the artist Fyodor Ivanovich, who gained renown in Rome. The American, Tadadenga, or Captain Joseph Brant, a chief of the Mohawk tribe, a sogenannter Wilder, a so-called savage, who, despite his Wilder, published learned articles in the philosophical transactions. The Caucasian, the group Blumenbach claimed embodied, and here he underlined this, our ideas of beauty, was, there's your Caucasian, Joseph Agia Effendi, the Turkish ambassador to London. The Malaysian was Omai, the Tahitian first brought to London and then accompanied Captain Cook on his third voyage to Tahiti. And the Ethiopian was Jacob Johann Eliza Capitan, a black theologian known for his publications in Latin and Dutch, who Blumenbach first discussed in his Beiträge zur Naturgeschichte. And in this work, he also cited examples of many blacks who distinguished themselves by their literary and scientific accomplishments. In the Abbildungen, he cited another example, Benjamin Banneker, an accomplished astronomer from Philadelphia, who had acquired his knowledge through his own studies of Ferguson's works and Tobias Meyer's tables. For Blumenbach, these examples demonstrated, and I quote, that intellectual ability is not influenced by skin color, end quote. But what has often been overlooked in the discussion of Blumenbach's racial typologies was his wide-ranging vision of what ethnographic research should do beyond discovering or demonstrating the existence of the physical differentiations of the people of the world. His ethnographic research incorporated the established and long-established Göttingen tradition of learned travel, a wide-ranging view of the intimate interconnections between humans and the environment in which they were nourished and the cultural world they inhabited. These positions were made evident by his commitment to what I have elsewhere described as Enlightenment vitalism, which infused nature with life. Vitalists considered nature's activities as founded upon reciprocal interaction, its apprehension a combination of hard observation and sympathetic aesthetic recreation. For them, it was imperative that a natural historian go out into the field in order to acquire first-hand exposure to the region's plants, animals, and its inhabitants in order to perceive the harmonious relationship existing between all aspects of living nature. Thus, Wied learned from his Göttingen studies, and especially from Blumenbach, that peoples cannot be understood without examining the wide range of their experiences, from their way of livelihood to their customs, religions, dress, food, and in true Göttingen manner, their languages. Wied faithfully carried out this program in his expeditions to Brazil and North America. From 1815 to 1817, he explored the east coast of Brazil, publishing a 2-volume narrative of his trip with a 3rd volume of images. In 1832, he undertook another journey, this time to the relatively unexplored regions of the upper Missouri in North America. He also published a 2-volume account of his journey, accompanied by a book of illustrations illustrated by the painter Carl Bodmer, who accompanied him on the trip. The Brazil trip framed his overall research program. The second, to North America, expanded it and reflected a much more mature appreciation of the material with which he dealt. These works present a fascinating picture of the regions and the native inhabitants, written by an astute observer, deeply enmeshed in the discourse of Enlightenment vitalism. Wied sought to recapture nature as it existed prior to Euro-American colonization, to find and portray in immediate ways the Urwälder, Urtiere, and Urvölker of the New World. Of course, this mission was impossible since the Portuguese had been in Brazil since the 16th century and white colonists in North America since the 17th. So Wied modified his project by seeking to explore those parts of Brazil and North America that were relatively untouched by massive Euro-American cultural aggrandizement. His search for original species, plants, animals, and especially peoples runs like a red thread through all of his writings. In his ethnographic deliberations, Wied sought to dispel false narratives of the peoples he encountered and false descriptions of the lands they inhabited. He directed his scorn especially towards those who uncritically accepted accounts of Native Americans, portraying them as cannibals, half-humans, people without a sense of religion, culturally deficient, and therefore objects to be controlled, enslaved, converted, obliterated, and when not killed, robbed of their unique cultures. This critical deconstruction of accepted Euro-American stereotypes led him to reconsider the nature of the peoples and the lands he was exploring. In so doing, Wied offered a searing critique of the manner in which white colonists, both in South and North America, treated the land and peoples they had conquered. In this process, he proposed an alternative vision of empire, strongly anti-imperialist in substance and intent. Wied's opposition to colonial imperialism manifests itself on two levels. The most obvious is a direct indictment he made of colonial rule. This indictment fills both reports. If I had the time, I would go into specific accusations he made of the manner in which white planters and colonists treated the native peoples, enslaving them, robbing them of their land, destroying their ecology, and most important, undermining or obliterating their cultures. If native peoples hated the planters and colonists, there was a good reason, Wied argued, for it was generated by the whites' treatment of them. Perhaps the most blatant attack upon native cultures by white colonists, who Wied dubbed sogenannte Amerikaner, so-called Americans, was that they had erased most memories of native cultures, as witnessed, for example, by the destruction of the impressive burial mounds in North America. And Wied believed that erasing a people's memory was prelude to erasing the people. Wied's direct critique of colonial activities is glaringly obvious. But there is another dimension to his work that demonstrates his comprehensive anti-imperialism in a more profound manner: his ethnographic portrayals of Native Americans of Brazil and North America. As many writers on imperialism and ethnography have argued, ethnographic reports that homogenized native peoples into single, undifferentiated categories paved their way for their dehumanization. Thus, to counter such dehumanization, native peoples would have to be seen as culturally, socially, and economically unique. A true Enlightenment anti-imperialism had to avoid the twin dangers of characterizing native peoples as either noble savages or as murderous barbarians. To acknowledge these people's real humanity would be to portray them as integrated and unique cultures with all of the strengths and their weaknesses, peoples different from Euro-Americans, but admirable in their own individual way. This project is what Wied's ethnographic analysis accomplished. Wied dealt with many peoples in South and North America, but in both the Brazilian and North American travels, he spent much of his time living amongst one particular people, stays that allowed him to probe deeply into each of their cultures. In Brazil, it was the people called the Botocudos, with whom he spent 3 months. In North America, it was the allied tribes of the Mandans and the Hidatsas, where he lived for the winter of 1833-1834. I will concentrate on the Botocudos and the Mandans. The Botocudos were one of the most feared of Brazilian native peoples. They were fierce warriors, but more significantly, they supposedly were cannibals. This reputation instilled terror in those who ventured into their territory, but also made the Botocudos perfect targets for extermination. At first, Wied shared the general European apprehension about the Botocudos. Still, he desired to get to know these people and forged on into the jungles of eastern Brazil in his quest. At his first meeting with them, he was instantly repelled. This is what he saw. Instantly repelled, finding them ugly and deformed because of the wooden plugs they wore in their lower ears. Once, however, he overcame his original distaste, Wied then followed what became his normal pattern of characterizing native peoples. By the way, these are his own sketches made in his books. These are not the printed illustrations. The printed illustrations are a disaster. They were totally idealized, the good savage people, so they're useless, actually. But these are sort of the things when he made his books, he always drew little pictures on the side, and these are his pictures, right? Once he overcame this distaste, he then followed his normal pattern of characterizing native peoples. He always began with a description of their physiognomy, followed by how they wore their hair, how they painted their bodies, with their dress, what decorations they wore, their weapons, how their huts looked, and what they ate. All of these observations dealt with what he called their outer appearance. Thus, for the Botocudos, he noted in his description their absolute nakedness, judged the men's bodies positively. They were muscular, slim, and well-built. His characterization of the female physiognomy was less positive, calling them ugly, small, broad, and fleshy. He then went on to describe their hair and what ornaments the males and females wore. Since all Botocudos went naked, there was no clothing to describe. In fact, the only piece of cover was worn by the men, a sack covering the penis made of dried leaves. You can see it on the picture there. The Botocudos painted themselves using red and black, sometimes painting one side of the body black and other parts red. Their huts were extremely simple. After describing the natives' bodies and surroundings, Wied turned to the social, religious, and emotional aspects of their cultures. A central theme in his ethnographic depictions, both in Brazil and North America, were gender relations, including topics such as marriage patterns, child rearing, domestic life, sexual relations, and gender-related work. Thus, for example, with respect to gender relations, Wied observed that Botocudo men were polygamous, having up to 5 wives, whom they treated as their own property. Marriages were formed without ceremony and easily dissolved. In fact, when a man was away, the wife could look around and find another, and if she did, there were no negative consequences. In all, the native Botocudan were, he declared, rather uninhibited in their sexual practices. Wied also discussed religion, ritual activities, warfare and hunting, leisure activities, and the Botocudos' psychological and emotional attitudes. He finished with an attempt to provide a dictionary of their language. In this endeavor, he sought out reliable informants that would allow him both to correctly transcribe their language and learn about their culture. In the case of the Botocudos, his major informant was a young Botocudan boy nicknamed Kwek, who Wied acquired by giving his parents gifts and whom he brought back to Germany when he returned. This is a picture of Kwek in 1832. Given the time limits, I will just discuss 2 of Wied's observations on the Botocudos. He addressed the then topical issue of whether the Botocudos were cannibals. As he became more acquainted with the Botocudos, he concluded that they did not eat flesh for food. But in a few isolated cases, when they defeated and captured a mighty, powerful enemy, they would, in a ritual ceremony, kill him and consume his flesh. The meat of the warrior was cut off and boiled. All ate the cooked meat and then danced and sang. In other words, a ritual passing of the power of the dead chief. The second theme in this short summary of Wied's observations is his characterizations of the Botocuto's psychological and emotional structures. He framed its characterizations around the two terms of civilized and raw. Civilized and raw natives, highly charged concepts that still plague ethnographic discourse. Wied judged the Botocutos to be amongst the rawest of peoples, but his evaluation of these two concepts, civilized and raw, was highly ambivalent, not a one-sided praise of either. On the negative side, the Botocutos were slaves to their senses and passions, not hampered by the restraints of bürgerliche Ordnung. Instincts and sensations shaped their imagination. Passions once awakened became, for a moment, their overriding impulse. On the positive side, they demonstrated a love for a free, independent life, which was deeply implanted in them from their earliest youth. Coupled with the love of freedom was their love of place, which Wied juxtaposed to chaotic city life. This tension between Ordnung and Freiheit, modern turmoil and simple Vaterlandsliebe informs all of Wied's portrayals of Native American peoples. In his description of the Botocutos, he made these qualities evident in his juxtaposition between Botocuto battle scenes. Here the Botocutos are fighting one another, and battle scenes with other native groups. He juxtaposed those with idyllic descriptions of life in what he called eine wilden Republik. In these latter images, one sees youth frolicking and swimming, climbing trees to gather fruit, and hunting for fish and food. He remarked in these scenes, one could observe with delight the Botocutos' lively activity. Wied's South American journey convinced him of the correctness of the idea that all North and South American native peoples were part of what Blumenbach called the American variety. Hence, his trip to North America was designed to discover the similarities between native North Americans and the Botocutos, to substantiate that all were part of one larger people, though very different in their individual cultures. His sojourns with the Mandans reinforced this view. Wied stayed at Fort Clark in present-day North Dakota near the city of Bismarck in the winter of 1833-34, adjacent to their major village, Tuta-Hankush, which is there on top of the hill. Both peoples had a mixed economy. They hunted bison and other animals, but also grew crops. Their villages were fixed, though they did move from one village or one location in the summer to another in the winter. That's a winter Mandan village. In all of Wied's ethnographic work, he followed the descriptive patterns he employed for the Botocutos. The physiognomies illustrated by Bodmer are magnificent. Here you have three. But instead of trying to sum up the topics Wied investigated, I'm going to concentrate on just one set of interrelated issues he portrayed, namely the intersection between religion, ritual, social organization, and dances. Though many contemporary writers claim that American natives had no sense of religion, Wied argued that religious beliefs were fundamental in structuring the social and emotional life of the groups he described. He did consider many of the Mandan beliefs superstitious, but he presented a very comprehensive account of them, for he believed they shaped the people's way of life. Wied asserted, for example, that the Mandan world was infused with an acute awareness of the existence of spiritual forces that shaped their life and to whom they could call on for help, forgiveness, and good fortune, or whom they had to avoid because of the evil they could do. This is one of their sites where they worshipped. For these reasons, they erected sacred places where they made offerings to powerful spirits, such as the Lord of Life, the original creator who lived in the sun, the first man, an almost equally strong spirit, and many other spirits which they called medicines. Thus, for example, certain animals, such as the eagle, the owl, the bison, and the beaver, were considered powerful medicines, as were certain sacred places, which that is, where they went to worship. Dreams directed them in how they would worship and to whom they should turn. They also served as prophecies. In the process of imploring and placating their myriad spirits inhabiting nature, certain medicine men played crucial roles in mediating between the humans and the spirits. Their ritual activities were organized within this corpus of belief, each ritual designed to serve a unique role in the people's lives, and as a rule, celebrated by special dances, chants, and practices. The dances were very structured, with rules about who could dance, what dress the dances should be, and how long the ceremonies should last. There were dances in which only men participated, and ones in which only women danced. There were many such diverse dances and festivals, amongst them the scalp dance, where only women are dancing, the buffalo dance, where men are dancing, the corn dance, and the penitence ritual. Finally, there were dances associated with the way in which society was structured. Mandan society was organized around a number of male and female associations. Wied listed 4 for the women and 6 for the men. They were based on age and also achievements, each marked by a specific dress and having their own chants. This is a member of the Dog Association. Members of one association bought their way into a higher one from a member who was leaving. The newcomers had to offer the leaver gifts, gift giving being a central act in all of their social interactions. Thus, aspiring males not only had to give the departing member horses and precious articles, but also make his wife or wives available to the leaver for a month. The prospective member also had to undergo certain exacting initiation ceremonies, such as sacrificing a finger joint to the Lord of Life. In all of these ritual enactments, smoking the peace pipe marked its symbolic beginning and end. And here you have a wonderful peace pipe. Wied and Bodmer gloried in these surroundings. Despite enduring bitter cold, hardship, hunger, and life-threatening disease, their return through the upper northern states of the U.S. was a depressing reintroduction into the bustling world of Anglo-American culture. The remnants of the native populations Wied encountered along the way only made him more disconsolate when he saw how much of their culture they had lost without gaining very much in return. But later in Germany, when he was putting the finishing touches to his travel narrative, these losses were made even more visceral. He ended the account with a plaintive afterword. An infectious disease, probably smallpox, had carried away virtually all of the Mandans. Despite his attempts to celebrate their individual humanity in his vitalist, anti-imperial travel narratives, much of what we know of these people, including the Botocudos, is drawn from Wied's narratives, and for North America, also from Bodmer's plates, showing us how the world once was and how perhaps it could have developed differently were it not for European and American imperialism. Thank you.